Mr. Smith for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, in my judgment, the President has ignored laws, failed to enforce laws, undermined laws, and changed laws, all contrary to the Constitution. It seems to me that the President is trying to make laws by executive decree at news conferences. But in a 2012 interview, the President said that he could not, quote, wave away the laws that Congress put in place, end quote, and that, quote, the President doesn't have the authority to simply ignore Congress and say, we're not going to enforce the laws that you've passed, end quote. Yet it seems to me that is exactly what he has done. I'd like to address my first question to Professor Turley, Professor Rosenkranz, and Director Cannon. I think I know their answer, but the question is, do you think, in fact, the President has acted contrary to the Constitution? Professor Turley, you mentioned that you supported the President's policies and even voted for him, yet you say he has crossed the constitutional line, the legislative process is not an option, and what the President has done is dangerous. So I assume your answer is yes, the President has acted contrary to the Constitution. Is that right?
It is, and I would also just add, Congressman, that this was an issue that the framers considered, 150 years before they drafted this provision, which didn't change much in the committee. This was a fight with James I, and the framers were very familiar with it, and I think that's what gave life to this very clause.
Thank you. And Professor Rosenkranz, do you think the President has acted contrary to the Constitution?
Representative, I would say that some of these cases are close cases, but some are not. So the wholesale suspension of law, for example, is, I would say, the paradigm case of a Take Care Clause violation, yes.
Okay, thank you. And Director Cannon?
Yes.
That's quick and easy. Thank you. My next question is a little bit tougher, and that is, what can Congress or the American people do about it? How can we restrain the President from acting in a way contrary to the Constitution? And Professor Turley.
That is, I think, the most difficult question that we face. I've had the honor of representing members of both parties of Congress in going to the courts, and the courts are quite hostile towards members standing, for example, when they believe a violation of the Constitution has occurred. It is, in fact, members standing that would solve many of our problems. That is, if members could go to the courts and raise violations of the Constitution, that would be would make much of these difficulties go away. You'll note that the administration has made reference to the fact, and I think they have some support for this, that they doubt people would have standing to challenge many of these acts. So we have something that the framers would never have accepted, that you can have violations of the Constitution, yet literally no one can raise the issue successfully with the courts for review.
Okay, Professor Rosenkranz.
Well, I'm actually not sure I agree with Professor Turley on the standing question. It's quite true that some of these violations may not be amenable to judicial review. Ultimately, though, the check on this sort of constitutional violation is elections. So this is exactly the sort of hearing we ought to be having, exactly the sort of hearing that the electorate ought to be paying attention to for our next round of elections.
Okay, thank you. And Director Cannon.
I think there's little that Congress can do if it is divided over the President's abuse of his authority. But it's very difficult to challenge an action of the President when he relaxes an obligation on a certain party. It's much easier to, if it is divided over the President's abuse of his authority. But fortunately, and as far as judicial remedies go, it's very difficult to challenge an action of the President when he relaxes an obligation on a certain party. It's much easier to find a plaintiff who has standing to challenge an action that imposes new obligations that the legislature never approved. That is what has happened in the case of the President issuing premium assistance tax credits through federal exchanges, because those tax credits will trigger tax penalties on employers and individuals in those 34 states that have refused to establish an exchange. And a number of those employers and individuals, including 2 state attorneys general, 15 Indiana school districts, and a dozen or more private employers and private citizens have filed suit, four different lawsuits. In fact, one of them will have oral agreements this afternoon here in Washington, D.C. So there is judicial remedy for some of these abuses.
Okay, good. Thank you, Director Kennan. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.